Hello, this is Dr. Nunez. Welcome to the Chapter 18 problem solving session. So we're looking at activity-based costing in this chapter. We are going to also have a couple of exercises that require us to use a single plant-wide overhead rate and even departmental overhead rates. We're going to start out, though, with exercise 18.3, which is an activity-based costing problem. We need activity rates. So we have here a firm that has total overhead of $900,000. They've divided the overhead into 4 activities. 1 is fabrication, 2 is assembly, 3 is setup, and 4 is inspection. So we have 4 activities, and we have the cost for those 4 activities: $240, $128, $160, and $372. So we have the 4 activities defined. We have the $900,000 that has been allocated to the 4 different activities. And we've got 2 products that we're going to be assigning cost to: speedboats and bass boats. And what we have to do is assume that we should find activity rates first for each activity. So we need 4 rates. And then we need the overhead assigned to each one of these products on a per unit basis. So let's focus on A first. We need activity rates. How do you get rates? Well, it doesn't matter whether it's activity-based costing or departmental rates or a single rate. The way you get a rate is always going to be the same. We want to take the cost divided by the activity. Right? So we want to take the cost for fabrication, $240,000, divided by 4,800 direct labor hours. We want to take the cost for assembly, $128,000, divided by 3,200 direct labor hours. We want to take the cost for setup, $160,000, divided by 400 setups. And finally, we want to take the cost for inspection, $372,000, divided by 1,500 inspections. That's how we're going to get our rates. So let's do that. Let's take the cost divided by the activity, and we'll get our rates. So here we have our rates. We have the activities listed here. We have the activity cost listed here. And then we're going to divide by the activity base. Divide by the base, and that'll give us our activity rates. Let me just clean this up just a little bit so that the formatting is a little bit easier to read. There we go. So we have the activities, we have the activity cost, we have the activity base. So fabrication costs $240,000 divided by the 4,800 direct labor hours. We have the activity rate. So we did exactly what I said we'd do, right? We take the activity cost divided by the activity cost divided by the activity, and we have our activity rates. That's what you do if you had a single rate too, right? You take the cost, all the overhead, divided by one activity measure. Now we're going to use this information to assign the overhead to the 2 products. And we're going to start with the speedboat first. So with the speedboat product, to assign overhead, all we're going to do is take the activity times the rate. So speedboat has 2,800 direct labor hours. In fabrication, the rate is $50 per direct labor hour. The speedboat has 2,800 hours in assembly. The rate is $40 an hour. The speedboat has 300 setups. The rate is $400 per setup. The speedboat has 1,100 inspections. The rate is $2,400. So to assign the overhead or allocate that overhead, we're just going to take the activity times the rate, right? The activity times the rate. So let me see if I can get that. So the speedboat, let's put that down here. The speedboat, there's the speedboat. So what we have here, and again, let me see if I can just clean that up just a little bit so that we can see what's happening here. Okay. So we have the activity fabrication. We have the activity base. The speedboat uses 2,800 direct labor hours, right? So let me reduce this a little bit so we can see what we've got. So the speedboat uses 2,800 direct labor hours, right, for the fabrication activity. And it's $50 per hour for fabrication. So 2,800 hours, $50 an hour, that's $140,000. That's what we allocate to the speedboat for fabrication. Speedboat uses 1,200 assembly hours, and the rate is $40 an hour. So 1,200 times 40, right? Gives us $8,000. Speedboat also uses 300 setups, right? And the setup is $400 each. So we got 300 setups times $400 gives us that $120,000, right? So the way we assign the overhead, doesn't matter whether it's a single rate or departmental rates or activity rates, it's going to be the activity base times the activity rate. It gives us the activity cost. And lastly, we have the inspection, 1,100 inspections, right? 1,100 inspections at $248 per inspection. 1,100 times 248, 272,800. And now when we put it all together, right, we need a total overhead. Total overhead for speedboat is 580,800. And because we need the overhead per unit, we're going to divide by the 400 units. Each product is budgeted for 400 units. So we're going to divide by the 400 units. So 580,800 of total overhead divided by 400 units means the factory overhead per unit is 1,452. That's what we need, the factory overhead per unit of, in this case, $1,442. So that's what we need for speedboats. And next, we also need to do the same thing, but for the bass boat. For the bass boat, and let me make sure that I have enough room here to paste that in. Don't have a lot of room, but if we can move this up just a little bit and then move this up as well, but I may move that up too much. I think that'll work. Okay. So now let's do the bass boat. And we're going to do basically the same thing, right? But the activity is different. For bass boat, we have 2,000 fabrication hours, 2,000 assembly hours, 100 setups, and 400 inspections. But the rates are the same. So we're doing the exact same thing. Take the activity times the rates, divide by the 400 units for the bass boat. Then we'll get the factory overhead per unit. So let's see if I put that right there. There we go. We got it. So for the bass boat, right, we've got our activity, and we want to multiply by the activity rate. And that will give us the activity cost, right? We want to multiply by the activity rate, and it will give us the activity cost. Same thing, right? It's just like with a single plant-wide overhead rate. You take the activity times the activity, you take the activity times the rate, that predetermined single plant-wide overhead rate, and you get the cost. That's all we're doing here. But we're doing it 4 times instead of 1 time with the single plant-wide overhead rate. So if I could mark things up a bit here, we, again, take the activity base fabrication times the activity rate. It gives us the cost that we allocate. The activity base times the rate gives us the allocated costs. Same thing for setup and for inspection. And then we put it all together and we get the total activity costs. So all the overhead that we allocate using ABC. And then we want to divide by 400 units again because we have 400 units of the bass boat too. And that gives us our final answer. That's what we need, right? The overhead on a per unit basis for the bass boat product. So basically, we're doing the same thing. We're doing it for the speedboat product, and we're doing it for the bass boat product. The allocation of overhead is just the activity times the rate. Add them all up. We got a total, divide by units. We got the overhead on a per unit basis. Okay? And we've completed Part A and Part B of 18-3. Now let's move on. So that's ABC. Now let's switch gears a little bit and focus on a single plant-wide overhead rate in exercise 18-1, a single plant-wide overhead rate. So the concept's the same, right? Whether we're using 1 rate, 2 rates, or 15 rates, right? What we want to be able to do when we use a single rate is take all the overhead, right? We bundled it all together. So one number for the factory overhead, the estimated factory overhead is 1,125,000, and we want to divide by the allocation base, right? Which is 50,000 machine hours. That gives us our rate. And then we take that rate and we use it to assign the overhead. And in this case, we only have one product, hoses, and we're going to assign the overhead to that hoses product. So we need to do two things. We need to find the rate, and then we need to take that rate and use it to assign the overhead. So let's see if I can paste that in here. So the rate, if you will, again, is all the overhead divided by all the allocation base, right? So if I could line these things up just a little bit better here. There we go. That's what we need. So we've got, in this case, again, the formula for a single rate. It's all the overhead divided by the allocation base, machine hours. So $1,125,000 divided by the 50,000 machine hours gives us our rate, $22.50 per machine hour. And then we know if we want to assign the overhead, it's just going to be the activity times the rate. That's what we need. We need the activity times the rate. So we know here that the hose product uses 18,000 direct machine hours, and the rate is 22.50. So to assign the overhead, all we need to do here is take the activity, right? 18,000 machine hours times 22,000 times $22.50 gives us the assignment of overhead, which is $405,000 for the hoses product. And that's it, right? One rate, assign the overhead, and just determine the total amount of overhead. So we don't need overhead per unit. We're not asked for that here. We'll just ask for total overhead, which is the rate times the actual activity. Actual 18,000 hours, rate of 22.50. We've got the assignment of overhead. That's it, a single rate. Now let's look again, right? We're going to continue in that fashion with a single plant-wide overhead rate, but we're going to do this now for three products. So we're progressing from, one product with a single rate to three products with a single rate. But now in this case, we need to find that single rate and then use that rate to assign the overhead to the three products. And we need to know the overhead on a per unit basis for each product. Let's deal with A first, part A. So if we need a single plant-wide overhead rate, then again, what we need is total overhead that's given right here, 1,874,400,000. We have total overhead divided by the total allocation base. So they define the way the rate should be calculated for us, right? The factory overhead of 18,744 should be allocated on the basis of direct labor hours. So that's our formula, right? The numerator is going to be overhead, the denominator is going to be the direct labor hours. The thing is, though, that they don't give us total direct labor hours. They just give us the components or the pieces we need to get total direct labor hours. How are we going to do that? Well, we have volume by product. We know that they're going to make 7,500 flutes, and it takes 2 hours to make a flute. Put those two pieces together. That'll give us total hours for flutes. They're going to make 1,500 clarinets, and it takes 3 hours to make a clarinet. That'll give us the total hours for clarinets. They're going to make 1,200 oboes, and it takes 1.5 hours to make an oboe. Put those two pieces together, and that'll give us total hours. So let me see if I can switch here, right, to typewriter mode. And what we need here is we need total hours. Total direct labor hours. So let's see, 7,500 units times 2 hours is 15,000 direct labor hours. And 1,500 units times 3 hours is 4,500. And finally, 1,200 oboes times 1.5 hours is 1,800 hours. Put it all together, and we've got a total of 21,300 hours. That's our total. So if I could, again, go back to my little pencil mode here, that's our total. This is total hours. So again, we want overhead divided by total hours. That's all we need to get a rate. The 1,008,744 divided by the total hours will give us the single plant-wide overhead rate that we need. So let's do that calculation. The single plant-wide overhead rate in part A. There we go. So let's see if we can't fix this just a little bit. There we go. Okay, good enough. So again, it's part A, right? In A, we need to take the total overhead, right? That budgeted factory overhead divided by the budgeted direct labor hours. So we got 1,874 divided by 21,300 hours. 21,300 hours. Divided by the 21,300 hours, and we end up with $88 an hour. $88 per direct labor hour. That's our rate. That's what we do in A. Take the total overhead divided by the total hours. But now we've got three products, and we need to know what the total overhead is for each product and what the overhead is per unit for each product. How are we going to get that? Well, the total overhead is just going to be the allocation of overhead based on the activity times the rate. So for example, flutes uses 15,000 hours and it's $88 an hour. That's the total overhead, right? 15,000 hours times $88 an hour. Clarinets is 4,500 hours times $88 an hour. Oboes is 1,800 hours times $88 an hour. And if we want to know what the overhead is per unit, we'll just divide the overhead that we allocate by the number of units. That's it. Divide the overhead by the number of units. So let me see if I can go ahead and paste that in as well. So B, right? B is the allocation of that overhead. There we go. Okay. So let's let me abbreviate these just a little bit so that I can get everything on here, because we got quite a bit here on this table. Okay, I think that might work. Okay, there we go. So we have, I could, so we have for flutes, we have 1,500 direct labor hours, 15,000 direct labor hours, right? 15,000 hours at $88 an hour is $1,320,000 of overhead that we applied to flutes. And we're going to make 7,500 of them. That's $176 per unit of overhead. Clarinets, we need 4,500 hours, and it's the activity hours times the rate. 4,500 times 88 is $396,000, and we're going to make 1,500 of those. Divide by 1,500, we got 264 per unit. Same thing for oboes. 1,800 hours at $88 an hour. That's the amount of overhead we apply. 158,400 divided by 1,200 units. We got $132,000. So we have, in this case, everything we need here, right? We've got A, find the rate, right? Take the overhead divided by the hours, but we had to actually find the hours, but that's an easy step, right? Just the volume times the hours per unit gives us total hours, right? Add them all up, we got total hours. We got that denominator. Okay, so single plant-wide overhead rate. Find the rate, use the rate. We're always going to use the rate in the same way. Take the activity times the rate gives us the applied overhead. Okay, So that's another example of a single plant-wide overhead rate. One more. Let's look at one more example of a single plant-wide overhead rate. Exercise 18.3. So in 18.3, now we've got a situation where, again, we've got three products: tortilla chips, potato chips, and pretzels. We need to find a single plant-wide overhead rate and basically do the same thing we just did. Assign the overhead and come up with a total overhead for each product and a per case overhead. So we need the total amount of overhead that should be assigned to tortilla chips and the overhead per case of tortilla chips. Same thing for potato chips and for pretzels. So how do we get a rate? Well, we take all the overhead divided by all of the processing hours. So if I could mark things up a bit here, we need to find total overhead, right? Divide the total overhead by the appropriate allocation base, which here is processing hours. So now we've got to use our knowledge from chapter 15 to get overhead, because they don't give us a total overhead number. They just give us total costs. And we know from chapter 15 that overhead does not include selling expenses. Overhead does not include administrative expenses. Overhead does include the depreciation, the indirect labor, the factory electricity, and the indirect materials. So all of these items, right, make up our overhead, right? That's what we're going to call overhead. We've got to add all those pieces together. And when we add all those pieces together, right, we're going to get our overhead number. So let me switch back to typewriter mode. It's a little easier for me to use the typewriter mode here for exercise 18-3. So the total factory overhead is $156,000. That's what these four things equal, $156,000. And we know that what we have to do is take that $156,000 and divide by the processing hours, right? We divide by the processing hours, then that will give us what we need. It'll give us our rate, right? That's how we get a rate. We take the factory overhead divided by the processing hours, right? Total factory overhead divided by processing hours will give us it'll give us the rate. So how do we get processing hours? We're going to do the same kind of thing we did in the last exercise. If we want processing hours, then take the number of cases, 3,000 tortilla chips times 0.25 hours will give us the total processing hours. 6,000 cases times 0.1 processing hours will give us the total hours. And 3,500 times 0.3 will give us the total processing hours. So again, we want to just do the math here, and we'll come up with the total processing hours. So the tortilla chips, well, the 3,000 cases times 0.25 gives us 750 processing hours. We do the same thing for the potato chips. 6,000 cases times 0.1 will give us 600 hours. And then lastly, the pretzels, 3,500 cases times a 0.3 processing hours will give us 1,050 processing hours. And in total, what that gives us is 2,400 hours. 2,400 hours in total. So that's our denominator, right? All the processing hours, 2,400. We want to divide by the 2,400 hours. That'll give us our rate, right? So divide by the 2,400 processing hours gives us a rate of $65. $65 per hour. That's our rate. That's our overhead rate, right? For the tortilla chips, the potato chips, the pretzels, we need to assign the overhead using a single plant-wide overhead rate of $65 per hour. Total overhead of $156,000 divided by 2,400 processing hours gives us a rate of $65 per hour. And then All we need to do is use that rate to assign the overhead, right? $65 an hour, 750 hours for tortilla chips, $65 an hour, 600 hours for potato chips, $65 an hour, 1,050 hours for pretzels. That'll give us total overhead. Divide by the volume, the number of cases, we got overhead per case. So let me see if I can get that, right? That overhead per case. So down here, let's put that, and we should be able to get that there. Yeah. So let's see if I can just kind of adjust these things just a little bit here. Okay. So there's our rate. Get the applied overhead, divide by the production. And I'm going to abbreviate this just a little bit so that we can get everything on this table. And then we can end up with the overhead on a per unit basis, overhead per unit. There we go. So total processing hours. Let me, no, that is not what I meant to do. And so let me put that back where I want it to be, which is a little bit further down. And actually, that's not what I want. Bear with me a minute. Yeah, I'm sorry, this is what we need right here. It's right here. So the processing hours for tortilla chips is 750. 750 hours times our rate we determined here is $65. So 750 hours times $65 is $48,750 of overhead. And we are making 3,000 of those. So divide by 3,000, it's 1625 per unit or per case. Same thing for potato chips. Take the hours times the rate. We apply the overhead, divide by volume. We've got overhead per unit. Same thing for pretzels. Take the hours times the rate, gives us the applied overhead, divide by volume. We've got the overhead per unit. So this is basically the same thing we did in the last exercise. It's just that, again, we've got different products and we have to start this one a little bit differently because we got to first find total overhead, right? Need to sort through this list of costs, eliminate the selling and admin expenses, just focus on the overhead. And it's the overhead divided by the hours. It gives us the rate. And then to assign the overhead, it's the activity by product times the rate. It gives us total overhead. And then just take the total overhead, divide by volume, and we've got the overhead on a per unit basis. Okay, let's move on now to multiple departments. So we've looked at a single plant-wide overhead rate. We've looked at ABC rates. Now in exercise 8.5, we're going to look at multiple departments. So departmental rates, right? Departmental rates. So we've got, in this case, two departments, right? We've got a pattern department, and we've got a cut and sew department. Those are the two departments. And the overhead has already been allocated to those two departments. So we've got $936,000 of total overhead, but it should be allocated $180,000 here to pattern and $756,000 to cut and sew. And we have these three products. We've got small gloves, medium gloves, and large gloves. And we need to assign the overhead to those three products and determine what the overhead is per unit. So for each glove, we need to know what the overhead is for each glove. So we got to find the departmental rates, and then we got to find the overhead for each glove, right? For a small glove, medium glove, and a large glove. So first thing we need to do is find the rates. So again, the way you find a rate, it doesn't matter whether it's one rate, two rates, or 15 rates, right? It's always going to be the cost divided by the activity, right? The cost, 180,000 divided by The activity for the pattern department, 36,000 hours. Is going to be the cost, 756,000 divided by the activity for cut and sew, 84,000. So let me see. I think I could probably just get the rates up here. I can post them in up there, and then we'll have them available. And actually, I'll put them at the bottom. It might be easier if I put them at the bottom. So if we're looking at the pattern department, right? The pattern department. Again, we're going to take the cost of 180,000 divided by 36,000 hours, right? So for the pattern department, we've got our rate being equal to the $180,000 divided by the 36,000 direct labor hours. $180,000 divided by the 36,000 direct labor hours. So when we allocate overhead from the pattern department, right, this is the rate for the pattern department, it's going to be based on $5 per direct labor hour. But on the other hand, when we allocate from the cut and sew department, well, it's going to be based on that $756,000 over 84,000 hours. So it's going to give us a very different rate for cut and sew. So this cut and sew department, if I have room, we'll put it right there. There we go. Okay. So for this cut and sew department now, we've got, in this case, the overhead of $756,000 is being spread over 84,000 direct labor hours. The rate is $9 per direct labor hour. So again, we've got two products, and we've got 3 products and 2 departments. The 2 departments, one is the pattern department, 2 is the cut and sew department. But the way we find a rate, well, it's the same. Doesn't matter whether it's a single rate or departmental rates or ABC rates. It's always going to be the budgeted overhead, right? Divided by the allocation base. So in this case, the budgeted overhead divided by the budgeted direct labor hours for pattern. The budgeted overhead for cut and sew divided by the budgeted direct labor hours for cut and sew gives us our rate. So we've got our $5 rate, we've got our $9 rate. That's what we're going to use to assign overhead to these 3 products, right? To small gloves, medium gloves, and large gloves. So let's do that. Let's assign that overhead to those three products. So let's see if I can, at the bottom here, hopefully I can paste everything in. I don't know if I can, but we'll give it a try. So right here. So again, all we're going to do is for the pattern department, the small glove needs 0.25 hours. The rate is $5. So it's 0.25 times 5. Activity times the rate. And the small glove needs 0.4 in cut and sew is 0.5 times 9, right? It's the activity times the rate. That's all we're going to do. Activity times the rate, activity times the rate, activity times the rate. We're going to do it for all 3 products. And that'll give us the cost for each glove, right? For a small glove, medium glove, and a large glove. So let me see if I can. I don't know if I can get all of this in here, but we certainly will try. If not, we'll do it one at a time. Okay, so we have to, and I don't have a lot of room here, but let's abbreviate some things here, and that'll make it, I think, a little bit easier. So we're going to take the direct labor hours, right? And it's going to be direct labor hours times the appropriate rate will give us the applied overhead. And again, I'm going to have to abbreviate things here so that I can get everything on this table. But allow me to make some adjustments here. So the rate, the direct labor hours times the rate gives us the overhead. And again, direct labor hours times the rate will give us our overhead. We got to do it for all three of these products. Direct labor hours times the rate will give us that applied overhead. And I think I can get everything on this table. We'll just have to abbreviate some things, and that's not a problem. As long as we get everything lined up. Okay, so let's see here for all three products, right? So we start with the pattern department. And for the pattern department, for the small glove, we have 0.25 hours times the rate of $5 is going to give us overhead of $1.25, right? And let's make sure we have everything lined up here. I think that might be good enough, maybe. Okay, I think I've got everything lined up. So let's talk about this now. So we have here, again, three products. And for these three products, let's make sure that we, I think my formatting just got adjusted. Okay. Okay. So we have here these three products, right? Small glove, medium glove, and a large glove. And it's going to be the direct labor hours times the rate gives us overhead, right? For all three of these. Direct labor hours times the rate gives us our overhead. So again, direct labor hours times the rate gives us the overhead. And we're going to do that for all three products. And we do it for each department. So let's start with the pattern department. So what's happening with the pattern department is for small gloves, we need 0.25 direct labor hours. So we got 0.25 direct labor hours. And the rate and pattern is $5. So it's just 0.25 times 5 equals our overhead, right? 0.25 times 5 gives us the overhead that we're going to assign to the small glove. And then same thing in the medium glove. We need 0.35 hours, right? Times $5. Large glove is 0.45 times $5. That's all we're doing is we're taking the activity 0.25, 0.35, and 0.5 times our rate. It gives us the cost, right? So we're saying it's $1.25 in overhead, right? It's $1.75 in overhead, and it's $2.25 in overhead. All it is the activity times the rate. And we do that for the pattern department for small gloves, medium gloves, and large gloves. It's the activity times the rate gives us the overhead. And we do the same thing for the cut and sew department. We take the activity times the rate. Only for the cut and sew department, well, it's 0.4 for small gloves and the rate is $9. 0.55 for medium gloves, the rate is $9. 0.70 for large gloves and the rate is $9. So we do the same thing, right? It's the activity times the rate gives us the overhead. In this case, the $3.60. It's the activity times the rate gives us the overhead, right? In this case, $4.95. It's the activity times the rate gives us the overhead, $6.30. And then we just add them, right? And that gives us total overhead. So for small gloves, it's $1.25 and $3.60 is $4.85. For medium gloves, it's $1.75 and $4.95. That's $6.70. For large gloves, it's $2.25 and $6.30. That's $8.55. That's the amount of overhead that we would assign to each unit for a small glove, a medium glove, and a large glove. So we find the rates, one for each department, and then we just take the activity times the rate. And we do that for each department, for each product. So again, we're just doing the same thing we did in chapter 16, all right? Except we're doing it twice instead of doing it one time. And that's multiple departmental rates and 3 products, right? Small glove, medium glove, and a large glove. Okay, let's switch gears now and go back to ABC. So with activity-based costing, and in this exercise, so they're going to make it a little bit easier on us in exercise 1810. What we've got here is ABC, and they've already calculated the rates for us. Right. So we already know here what the rates are, what the activity rates are, and all we need to be able to do here is use the rates to assign the overhead to these 2 products, to the ellipticals and the treadmills. Well, if that's the case, then in using the rates to determine, in this case, the total activity cost and the cost per unit, well, the way we assign overhead is just by taking the activity times the rate, right? The activity. We have, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 activities. So we got to do this 6 times, right? So we assign the overhead again to elliptical machines. It's the activity times the rate. The activity times the appropriate rate. We do it 6 times, add them up, we got total overhead. Divide by units, we have the overhead per unit. So same thing we've been doing, right? Take the rate, multiply times the activity, we get total overhead. Divide by units, we get the overhead per unit. Let's do it for the individual products. So let's focus on the ellipticals first, and then we'll look at the treadmills. So for the ellipticals, again, all we're doing is we're taking the activity times the rate. So for ellipticals, I'll do that right here. So there are the ellipticals. So we have the activities. See if we can just spread this out a little bit. The activity times the rate. The activity times the appropriate rate will give us the activity cost. Divide by the volume, and that will give us the cost per unit. Good enough. So here we are for ellipticals, right? One product. We have the activities listed here. We have the activity base for each of these activities. And we have the activity rates we're given. That's how we get an activity cost, right? It's the base times the activity gives us the cost. And again, everything's given. We don't have to calculate these things, right? The base is given. right? So the activity base, they're defined here. And then we know for ellipticals, they use 500 machine hours, 200 hours, 20 setups, 30 inspections, 15 orders, 40 orders. So we've just got those listed there, right? That's all the activity listed there. And all the rates, well, the rates are given, right? We're just taking this column, the activity base for ellipticals times the activity rates. Do the math, right? So the activity base times the activity rate gives us the activity cost. And then we add them all up, right? Add them all up. So the total overhead cost that we're allocating to ellipticals is 27,300. And we're making 400 of those. That's right there. We're making 400 of those. So the total cost divided by the total activity, total cost divided by the total number of units, it gives us the overhead per unit. $68.25 is the total factory overhead per unit. That's what we're doing for the ellipticals. And we do the same thing for treadmills, right? Take the activity, right? Treadmills, we have different activity for treadmills. It's all given here. Multiply times rates. Divide by the number of units. We have the answer, right? So let me see if I can put that here as well. Treadmills, the activity times the rates. So for those treadmills, let's put that right here. Let's see if we can't just make a few formatting changes here. Okay, so we've done basically the same thing here, right? We have, in this case, the treadmills product. We have the activity defined, and we need to, let me just make one correction here. So we have all of the activity defined here, those 6 activities. And we have the activity base for treadmills that's given, right? The activity base is given for treadmills. And we're just going to multiply times the activity rates that are given. So the base times the rate gives us the activity cost. So the activity base for treadmills times the activity rates gives us the activity cost. We want to add all those costs, come up with a total, divide by the number of units, and we have our answer. We have the overhead on a per unit basis. And again, the number of units that's given to us in the table. They made 250 units. So just take this is just a mathematics problem, right? Just take the activity times the rate, we get the cost, add them up, divide by the number of units, and we have what we need. Okay? So we didn't have to calculate rates. We only had to use the rates to assign that overhead, and that's what we've done. Okay. So I think that is all that I have assigned for this chapter. And hopefully this is enough to give you what you need for your application assignment and your quiz. Certainly, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll see you in chapter 19. That's it.